We begin with the newly released transcripts from two more key witnesses in the impeachment inquiry ended an explosive week of damning revelations for President Trump. They detail the blatant and explicit push by the Trump administration to pressure Ukraine to investigate the president's political rivals in exchange for military aid and a coveted White House meeting. And for the first time, White House officials testified the quid pro quo was orchestrated by acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney. This as another potential witness, former National Security Advisor John Bolton, signals he knows key new details that House investigators do not. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, the top Ukraine expert on the National Security Council, was listening in on the July 25th phone call when he heard what he called obvious demands by President Trump for Ukraine's president to investigate the Bidens and the 2016 election. He was asked, quote, was there any doubt in your mind as to what the president, our president, was asking for as a deliverable? Vindman answered, there was no doubt. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman was also present when Ambassador Gordon Sondland told Ukrainian officials that a face-to-face meeting with President Trump was dependent on Ukraine making a public announcement of these investigations. He described the quid pro quo, quote, it was explicit. There was no ambiguity. The hold on Ukraine's military aid came directly from the president's chief of staff, according to Vindman's testimony. Quote, Sondland had a conversation with Mr. Mulvaney, and this is what was required in order to get a meeting. In order to get the White House meeting, they had to deliver an investigation, end quote. Fiona Hill, who served under John Bolton, also pointed to Mulvaney as coordinating the extortion plot, testifying, quote, Ambassador Sondland, in front of the Ukrainians, as I came in, was talking about how he had an agreement with Chief of Staff Mulvaney for a meeting with the Ukrainians if they were going to go forward with investigations. Now, these revelations shed new light on the comments that Mulvaney made last month.
Did he also mention to me in the past the corruption related to the DNC server? Absolutely. No question about that. But that's it. And that's why we held up the money.
But to be clear, what you just described is a quid pro quo.
We do that all the time with foreign policy. Get over it. There's going to be political influence in foreign policy.
We do that all the time in foreign policy. Get over it. Not surprisingly, Mulvaney refused to comply with a subpoena to testify in the House Impeachment Committee hearings today before the hearings go public next week. Fiona Hill also testified that Bolton objected to what he called the, quote, drug deal that Mulvaney and Sondland were cooking up. Quote, Bolton believed that they were making an improper arrangement, predicating the meeting in the White House on the Ukrainians agreeing to restart investigations that had been dropped. Hill testified that Bolton repeatedly told his staff that no one should be meeting with Rudy Giuliani, the president's lawyer, after former Ukraine ambassador Marie Yovanovitch was ousted, a direct result of the campaign that Giuliani set in motion, according to Hill. Quote, Bolton directly said, Rudy Giuliani is a hand grenade that is going to blow everybody up. As House Republicans prepare for their list of witnesses for the Trump impeachment inquiry, Trump's allies are employing a new tactic to try to defend the president. The Washington Post reports that Republicans are, quote, sowing doubts about whether Sondland, Giuliani, and Mulvaney were actually representing the president or freelancing to pursue their own agendas. The GOP is effectively offering up the three to be fall guys. That might explain why Donald Trump tried to distance himself today from his multi-million-dollar donor turned ambassador.
Gordon Sondland said at the beginning of September he presumed there was a quid pro quo. Then there was a telephone call to you on September the 9th. Had he ever talked to you prior to that telephone call?
Let me just tell you, I hardly know the gentleman, but this is the man who said there was no quid pro quo, and he still says that.
I hardly knew the gentleman. That's a far cry from his tweet just last month, calling Sondland, quote, a really good man and great American. but I hardly knew the gentleman. Gordon Sondland revised his testimony this week and admitted that he told Ukrainian officials a White House meeting was conditioned on Ukraine launching these investigations. Still unclear whether John Bolton will testify, but in a letter to the House General Counsel today, Bolton's lawyer said that John Bolton, quote, was personally involved in many of the events, meetings, and conversations about which you already have received testimony, as well as many relevant meetings and conversations that have not yet been discussed in the testimonies thus far. Leading off our discussion tonight is freshman Democratic Congressman Harley Rouda from California. He is a member of the Oversight Committee. He's attended both Fiona Hill and Lieutenant Colonel Vindman's depositions. Natasha Bertrand is a national security correspondent for Politico. She's an MSNBC contributor. And Neera Tanden is a former senior advisor to President Obama and Hillary Clinton. She is president and CEO of the Center for American Progress. Welcome to all three of you. Thank you for being here. Congressman, I want to ask you, because you've had a chance to listen into some of this testimony, there's an interesting pattern to it. There's a lot of similarity. If you're not familiar with these names, there will be a sameness to the testimony because they are testifying or they have been given in their depositions. They've given details that largely support each other with one exception. And that was Gordon Sondland, who gave a deposition. He gave statements, and then he went back and fixed them to be more in line with the testimony of others.
That's absolutely correct. Every single one of these witnesses that has come through have provided very consistent stories that line up exactly with what the whistleblowers report said, with the exception of Ambassador Sondland. Ambassador Sondland had an acute case of selective amnesia when he testified. And many would probably suggest it was borderline perjury at times. And obviously him coming back and supplementing his testimony was to basically try and fill in holes after he saw how others testified.
And Fiona Hill has subsequently said, even after his repaired testimony, that he's still not fully telling the truth. Fiona Hill said about Sondland today, I had a blow up with Sondland when he told me that he was in charge of Ukraine, because initially I said to him, you're not. And I said, who has said you're in charge of Ukraine, Gordon? And he said, the president. Well, that shut me up, because you can't really argue with that. Gordon Sondland is the American ambassador to the European Union. A lot of people might really want Ukraine to be in the European Union, but it's not. And we had an ambassador there, and then we had a charge d'affaires there. So Gordon Sondland really didn't have business leading Ukraine policy at the White House.
No, that's exactly correct. And we have to keep in mind, every one of these witnesses, again, with the exception of Ambassador Sondland, are Foreign Service officers, people who have dedicated their life to being apolitical, serving presidents, both Republican and Democrat, through multiple administrations. They take very copious notes of every single meeting and phone call. On the other hand, Ambassador Sondland is a political appointee of Trump's, who got the job basically for giving $1 million to his inauguration. So unfortunately, we've got almost the Keystone Cops here with him and Giuliani and Secretary Perry and others trying to run this back channel of communication.
Natasha, you're a national security expert, and there is a massive national security component to this. So while there are some people who will be frustrated, horrified, disgusted with what it is alleged that President Trump has done because he may have done something for personal political gain, the more important part of the testimony from Vindman and Fiona Hill was the risk at which the United States, in holding back this $391 million, was putting Ukraine at, in the midst of a remarkably important confrontation that Ukraine is having with Russia.
Absolutely, Ali. And one of the most striking things, I think, going back to the deposition that was released yesterday of a top State Department official, George Kent, was when he said that the Ukraine aid that the U.S. gives to Ukraine in order to fend off Russian aggression is actually more in the national security interest of the United States than it even is in the national interest of Ukraine. And he said, I can't get into that in an open setting. I can only really get into the details of that in a classified setting with my counterparts from the Pentagon and the State Department. But he emphasized this point, that this was not just the president trying to get personal political favors. It's not just about that. It's also about the president toying with U.S. national security. And I think once you start to think about it in those terms, in terms of fending off Russian aggression of the kind that, we weren't really helping with before Russia invaded eastern Ukraine in 2014 and then annexed Crimea, and look what happened, then you start to get a fuller picture of the real risk that the president put the United States at here just in order to get dirt on his political rivals.
So that's the issue is, as this becomes public and as we are seeing these transcripts of the depositions, there are many Americans, possibly even conservative Americans, to whom that may be the bigger problem. The national security risk that we put our allies in, as well as the national security risk to America. This is not charitable food donations to Ukraine because of a famine. This is actually in the national interest of the United States that this policy was approved by Congress and that funding was approved by Congress. A guy like Mick Mulvaney, back in his days as a member of Congress, would have had a massive problem with that.
Yeah, if this is what I would say about this is that Ambassador Taylor also in his opening letter really makes clear how much the Ukrainians relied on it. He testifies vividly, or he speaks vividly, of going to the front lines and seeing soldiers fighting, and his concern is that soldiers would die without the aid, or more people would die without the aid. So I think that is an issue of national security for the Ukrainians, but obviously, as Natasha points out, it's also a national security issue for us. I think the issue with the public testimony is we will see a series of public servants really spell out not really just the quid pro quo, but really what a quid pro quo is, which is the president of the United States and his extortion tactics. And the idea that Republicans are putting up a notion that Mick Mulvaney, the president's chief of staff, came up with this on his own, when we, again, let's just remind everyone, have the transcript or the memo released by the White House saying that it's in the president's own words. I have a favor here, though. It's the president's own words that connect him back, and it's not going to be possible, I think, for Americans to see Mick Mulvaney, the president's chief of staff, as a lone wolf on this issue.
Congressman Rouda, this is a fascinating line that the Washington Post repeating that is a reporting that is a part of the GOP strategy that Neera was just talking about, painting one or two or three of Sondland, Mulvaney, and Giuliani as the real masterminds behind this. They well have been executing it and delivering the messages. It becomes hard to understand, maybe with the exception of Giuliani, who seemed to be running a side hustle in Ukraine, why they would hold back this military aid in exchange for an investigation for their personal gain, because it's not obvious what the personal gain to the three of them would be.
You're exactly right. And we've seen this movie before. We saw it with Michael Cohen.
Yep.
The president turned on Michael Cohen. Michael Cohen even admonished everyone in the hearing in front of my committee on oversight that beware, Trump will turn on you, too. So I fully expect President Trump to start distancing himself from Giuliani and the rest of them and arguably throwing them under the bus.
Congressman, good to see you. Thank you for joining us. Congressman Harley Rouda, Natasha, Bertrand, and Neera, Tanden, please stay with us.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.